All right, so here we go with week 9. John Micah has saved you all. He pointed out on the syllabus that I had the wrong date for spring break, so that spring break is next week. So that, for those of you who are on the web course, we will have class. It's marked the spring break is on the 23rd, but that's not correct. So I need to make sure and get that word out to everybody that spring break is next week. So just change, obviously what is marked for the 15th will happen instead on the 22nd. Right. Also, on the 29th, that's the day of Nurture. If any of you are interested, that's a really good program here on campus on spiritual formation. So if you're available, certainly welcome to that. All right, so, man, there's a lot to talk about tonight, and some of it will come out of our reading, some of it I want to add to it, just because tonight we're talking about the missional leader. What did you, just your reaction, anything out of your reading before? Oh, by the way, let me tell the ones on the web, I'm sorry for the difficulties we're having with integrity. We don't know what's causing that. We've got techs working on it. Of course, it strikes me that here I am talking to you, and if your computers aren't working, you're not hearing this anyway. But those of you with Mac computers are the ones that are struggling, and I'm sorry about that. Hopefully we'll get this thing worked out this week. But tonight we'll probably have 3 shorter lectures instead of 2 long ones to make sure I can at least upload them on YouTube. We had trouble with that last week too, so we'll try to figure out what's going on. Okay, thoughts about, just from the reading, general thoughts before we dig in and I tell you what you should have thought. Good, you laughed.
Just his overall language of how important it is to cultivate leaders who are going to be able to communicate this stuff.
Yeah.
And you mentioned last week, and it didn't dawn on me until I got into this second part heavily, but all the time time frames he puts on everything. While I do believe this is going to take time, I don't know how you can begin to put certain months to months on some of these categories like he does, but I still buy that it's going to take there's going to be a huge learning curve.
Yeah.
But how do you it's exciting to think about how to continue to cultivate other leaders to buy into this, but the importance he puts on us being cultivated into that mindset. So, right. And he does put things in nice little neat shells here and there, but I have a problem with the model in regards to awareness being the first stage and moving on down into things like that. I don't know how some of it can be so crisp and neat, but I think you can still pull from all this.
Right.
And they've done interesting. I'd be interested to kind of see if they've got articles and things out there that with some of these churches they talk about the work that they've done with some of their places.
Yeah, over time.
Yeah, to see how that's worked out.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into the next book, Structured for Mission, because he's done that. I mean, this is his latest of many books, and so we'll see. Well,
that was neat. It was neat to see the stories.
Yeah.
It was neat to hear the frustrations of some of these other guys who are in different worlds and giggle about some of that because we've never dealt with that before. But it's rich. It's very practical. That's the word I'm looking for, is taking all this in-depth information, but he makes this pretty.
Yep.
He makes you think it's tangible and doable.
Yep. Anyone else? Other thoughts, Terry?
I had just the opposite thought.
Okay.
I don't think it's tangible and doable. No. I think if you had an organization that had a leader and that leader bought into this, I can see how that happens. But where I go to church with you have a plurality of leadership.
Sure. I get that.
Yeah, the chances of getting more than 1 or 2 people to buy in, I had an issue with it. I don't know that it can be done easily. I think the general approach, I think it's the right approach. However,
right.
There are people,
yeah.
And I think as you look at, as somebody in the audience, as somebody, a part of the organization, not necessarily the leader, when you're taking so long to see some sort of change happen, I need a new leader, because I'm used to change happening faster. I saw where on page 115 it had leadership depends on the leader's maturity, trust, and integrity. Okay, I can agree to that. It says nothing about their persona, their power. It says nothing about their humility. So I'm not sure that you can have humility. You know you have to have. So we're trying to encourage a different lifestyle, and if you'll just sit back with your old lifestyle and wait several months, okay, a year or two or three, I think people will get frustrated with that and won't like it.
Well, yeah, and I'm going to push.
Something
I think I'll push back against that a little bit in that.
Okay.
Well, let me look at with you for just a moment at what he picks up on at the very beginning. And again, we're not going to stay with the reading all night tonight. We'll follow some of it because I think it's a really good basis for some of the other things that I want to say. But this is basically what I'm doing tonight is pulling together everything that I teach in that DMIN program on missional leadership and trying to give you some resources that I think
Yeah, thanks.
could really be helpful to you. But, this idea, that his general take is, and what Terry brought up is really an important idea. Depending on your leadership structure, some of you come out of pastor-led models. In Churches of Christ, it really is dependent on the relationship between the preacher and elders. And I've seen it work both ways, where the elders basically have turned over the direction to the preacher and say, pretty much you tell us what to do. And then I've also seen elders that are very hands-on, and the preacher better do what they say. And so we've got to keep that in mind. But still, if you're going to be involved in leading, first of all, this idea of taking stock of what you know. All kinds of leadership books have been written that start out with this idea that honesty and honest assessment is the starting point of change. And you have to be honest about who you are and take stock of what you know. The idea is you have to have a starting place, and you better be honest about it. Because one of the things that kills most church initiatives is what is called the lethal assumption. And that is where you make certain assumptions about things without really checking into it. And it just ends up having devastating results because landmines are laying out there that you don't know about. So the idea of, take stock, find out where you are. It doesn't do any good here to be an optimist. You have to be a realist at the starting point. Then the next point, we're going to talk about this quite a bit tonight. I had a really good weekend with the Northside Church here in Nashville, working through the idea of living into the story of God. And I had a man come up to me, and what I did is I did a leadership seminar on Saturday morning, then I did a seminar for the entire congregation all afternoon, and then I preached and taught class the next morning. But I had a man come up to me that had been to all the sessions, I would say probably early 30s. But he was in charge of one of the ministries, the important ministries of the church. And he just said, you've been talking about this kind of leading, and I just feel like I'm not a leader. I'm just not a born leader. And you could tell even just by his demeanor that he was not that charismatic, go-get-'em kind of guy. He was cautious. He was careful in selecting his words. And I told him what I tell the students that I'll be talking to next week. Part of what I'll do next week is teach in my leadership academy in Scotland, high school kids. And one of the things I'll tell them is leadership is not born, it's learned. However, it doesn't look the same in every person. So leadership qualities are not, and this is one of the wonderful things about the nature of the kingdom of God that we'll talk about tonight, that what Jesus does with his leadership style is he opens up leadership to anyone who would choose to lead. And so there are ways of leading with charismatic power, but those aren't necessarily very efficient or effective ways of leading. It may be easier for some than others, but leadership skills are learned. But you've got to know yourself as a leader, meaning you simply cannot afford to pattern your leadership after someone else. You might find someone that has a similar personality style, but even there you can't clone leadership. So what we're really going to look at are qualities of leadership, which, by the way, in our reading tonight, Roxborough talks about it some, but that's not his point. Tonight's more of a structure talk from him, and we'll come back to that. And then,
Sorry,
jump in.
This know yourself, is that a big part of his assessment tool at the very end that you can tap into, as far as once you assemble your team, and that particular tool is
Right.
what helps you to do this?
Yeah, that's part of what it'll do. So it's personality assessment
Gotcha.
in various ways. But I do know this, that I've had success in helping people who would normally have been seen as not leadership material become strong leaders, but only when they come to understand that they don't lead in the same way others are going to lead. So leadership is not a methodology. It's a choice, and it's built on trust, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Then, of course, listen, that's obvious. Focus on key areas and issues, develop an action plan, and commit to it. So these were this is out of the first reading. So he picks back up on this basically and says, here's what I've told you. If you're going to have the missional change model, it looks like this. And so develop an action plan. By the way, these slides are posted if you want to pull them up. But I want you to note this movement when the personal attributes are taken into account. That here's what I want us to really think about. That what he identifies now are qualities of leadership, and there's three major directions. One is in the cultivation of people. So leadership are responsible for the development and equipping of people. Okay? Now you can look on his boxes and charts, and that's part of what he talks about. And then he talks about forming a missional environment, which is, again, that idea of cultivating. We're going to talk about that a lot tonight. And changing the narrative. Now, Roxborough doesn't talk about narrative theology like I would, but I think basically what you're trying to do is to take into account the good parts of the past narrative, and what the leader does is he changes the script, fully aware of the good things of the past, but also aware of the things that did not go well. And so the responsibility of leadership is to cultivate people, to form a missional environment. And then, this is the thing we're going to talk about last part of class. We'll focus on this a little bit more. Especially in the last book we're reading. I'm interested in seeing how you're going to respond to that, because it's a new book for me. And one of the things I think we need to be more intentional about, and I'll talk about this tonight, is helping our people actively and positively engage in their culture. So this is cultural contextualization. And I do think that we would be much better served if we would take into consideration how important it is to develop our members for work that we would rather do ourselves. This is the key to understanding what it means to be a missional leader. And that's why I think not everyone can be a successful church leader as presently construed. And some of you know people who are likely in leadership positions that don't lead well. But missional leadership makes leadership accessible to everyone because it's a different kind of leadership. It's not an out front, charismatic, follow me up the hill kind of leadership. It's leadership that cultivates people, knows how to tell a new story for the church, and understands culture. And that's available to all of us. Now, even there, we're going to interact with people differently in terms of how we approach this. But when you look at this idea of the missional leader and the specific skills needed by a missional leader, it talks about this idea of fostering a missional imagination among the people themselves. Now, once again, this is a different kind of leader. And this, Terry mentioned before we started the tape, I think, tonight, that he would be concerned that what Roxborough talks about probably wouldn't work in a church where you didn't have a strong leader.
Or yes, a strong leader.
A strong leader. So if you had a plurality of leaders.
That would be much more difficult because they would all have to be in the same mindset, the same everything.
Right.
I think that's more difficult than just one.
And Terry, I don't disagree with you on that, because I think we see it in our churches. And I think where I'm coming from right now is thinking, okay, if I'm in that setting, how can I still do this in that setting?
Yeah.
You know, in a way that's going to be a little
Well,
bit with my eldership, them not understanding what's going on.
Right.
In a way, missional leadership is subversive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's sneaky. It can be, anyway. It doesn't have to be. I mean,
when I emailed this weekend, that word was popping through my head going, this is doable. From
Well,
a subversive perspective to a degree. But
because it's not upfront, let's go let's go get it leadership.
I got it.
It's kind of leadership where you're going to measure it differently. And I actually think it is probably the more effective leadership style than what the big, flashy person up front can do compared to the person who is working in grassroots and changing stories. Over time, that person is going to make a bigger difference. You can disagree with me, but I'm just talking about. That's what I've talked to a couple of coaches lately who have been discouraged by their ability to lead their team in ways they want them to go. But part of the problem I think they're lacking is their ability to hand off responsibility for any kind of team building from the team itself. In other words, that sort of coercive, this is what we're taught as coaches. This is what we're supposed to do, is tell everyone what to do and where to be and how to do it. But that's not a very effective form of coaching. And I'll tell you, from the years that I coached, what I found out in every situation I found myself in, I'm talking about coaching things as different as professional baseball and, Little League baseball and high school cross country, is if you can't build responsibility among the participants themselves, your leadership is really stunted in terms of what it can ultimately accomplish. So this idea of fostering a missional imagination among the people themselves, how do we do this kind of thing? And part of it is through the telling of stories and allowing our stories to be heard. But stories are perhaps the most significant imagination casting mechanism. I read a book this week that I really found interesting. I'd read it before and sort of reread it. It was talk about redeeming the imagination. And the author was talking about how, the fantasy life that we have that's so easily misguided into going into areas that it doesn't need to go. If we can redeem the imagination to help us dream about what God could do through us and through others, that you can often live into that imagination if that's what you choose to think about. And so, part of it is just being able to sit down with people, and this idea of cultivating growth through specific practices and habits of Christian life. Again, this is available to everybody. But as you create a missional imagination, and then you cultivate your own personal growth through specific spiritual practices and habits of Christian life, I think this is where the strength of leadership really comes. Then you enable people to understand and engage the multiple changes they face in their lives. This is a much different kind of leadership. This is much more intimate, and obviously, our current form of leadership would not be capable of doing this, just simply because the numbers are too large. But if you can permeate your church with missional leaders who are able to help people understand what's going on in their life in the context of the larger story of God, I think that could be a really significant thing. Can I help you with something?
Is this University of Learning?
No, this is a master's class in Bible.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Creation of a coalition of interest, dialogue, energy, and experimentation among the people of the congregation. I really like that idea. I challenged. This is part of what I talked about this weekend in the seminar that I held with Northside, and I really like the idea. I haven't seen it fully embraced yet, except in churches that are small, and I've been able to do this there. But what would happen, for instance, if you would get people together who had like interests? Now, I did tell you about the church that I planted in Illinois, and I think this was the secret of our success. And the more I look back on that experience, which is the most effective and the most fun I've ever had in ministry, most effective church plant, a lot of the concepts we were using were missional concepts before I knew that's what they were. But I look at this and see the reason I thought these bullet points were so interesting is because this is the kind of work I was doing. And it's a coaching model. So what the coach does is he sits down with an athlete and tries to foster an imagination of improvement and their potential participation and what they might bring to the team. And so if you can create an image for an athlete that they can live into rather than shame that they refer back to, it's a much higher motivator. And then, of course, you're trying to give them opportunities to improve the skills that they have through specific practices that would greatly enhance their ability to work well in the world. And then enable people to understand and engage the multiple changes they face in their life. In other words, you're helping them work through the developmental phases of their life then you put people together who have common interests and just watch what happens.
It's, I think, an experimental part of it that's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, that means you're going to fail too.
It's a good business model.
It is a good business. Sure.
The problem with it is your boss requires certain reports and expectations that are much different than you are exhibiting.
Yeah, and it's not a volunteer.
short run.
I mean, basically, church is a volunteer organization.
Right.
But what studies are showing is that motivators, even in volunteer organizations, are dependent on the matching of a person and their passion with the deeds that they're assigned. So that's why if you get people together that really enjoy hospitality and have them create whatever your hospitality effort's going to be for the community, they're going to do a much better job than if you put, like an elder and a deacon, and we assign our work committees out in places where people, it's almost like an assignment, and there's no passion there, there's no imagination. Okay. Identity and character of a leader then, and this is where, this is the really important stuff, because we're talking about character here. So no matter what your personality is, personal maturity, that is being present to self and others, being authentic, being self-aware, this is just absolutely essential. Now, Roxborough spends some time on this, and I'm going to give you some resources in a moment that I think are really helpful to this end. But the idea of a person, I want to also look at a book with you tonight written by Lance Ford called Unleader. And he talks about why most people who are in leadership, he says most, so this is Lance, not me. But he says most people who are in church leadership should not be. For this very reason. They don't have a good image of themselves, and they're this idea that he calls personal maturity. And personal maturity is you know who you are and you're comfortable there. So you're not trying to step outside of your personality. I don't know if you know people like that. I do. I have a friend that I deeply love who, when he gets up in the pulpit, everything changes. I mean, it's like scary. He goes from a soft, easygoing guy to a harsh, sort of barking guy. And he was taught preaching methodology that is not consistent with his personality. And so it sounds as fake as it is. And I just keep trying to convince him. He wonders why he gets fired every 2 years, and it's because that's all people can take of that. And if he could just be himself, he's really a good communicator. But he's been taught a method of communication that's not consistent with his personality. So I can't tell you how important I think this is that God created you as you are. Personality is God-given. And you can't change who you are, but you need to take full advantage of it. And everyone can be a missional leader, but you've got to be true to yourself. And so if you can't be authentic and self-aware, do not surround yourself with people who will tell you you're good when you're not. You need someone who's going to love you enough to tell you the truth. And then that's a really good place. Honesty is a starting point of change. Then, do you have is there an aspect in this program for conflict management? Do you do that? Is that required?
I explored that last semester. They will let us take Dr. Joyner's conflict management course that has to do with in religious environments.
Yeah.
As an elective.
Okay.
But it's not anywhere on our sheet that you can't take that.
Well, we built it into the that new cohort because this may be one of the more important things you can talk about. You will have conflict. There's no way that you won't. And the fact that we haven't taught this in general seminary training is shocking to me. But in most seminary training, if you look at it, you can go all the way through an MDiv program, take 80 hours, and never have a course in conflict management. And it's to be expected, especially if you're going to bring about change. And if you have a church where there's no conflict, that's not a good thing. That means it's dead. And conflict is an opportunity to grow. It's just whether we see it that way or not. And so this has been really helpful to me, that whenever conflict comes up, it's a spiritual discipline for me to say, here's an opportunity to grow. Now, the painful part is it may be me that needs to do the growing, but the conflict presents an opportunity for things to get better. And so if there's no conflict, there's no movement. And, Roxborough just briefly talks about practice makes a difference. But pay attention to this in terms of conflict management. I'm going to talk more about it later in the presentation tonight. Personal courage, leadership is not for the faint-hearted. Now, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at characters of leadership And notice that all of these characters are things that everyone can work toward. So it's not charismatic leadership. It's not the ability to, coalesce people or whatever. It's not that. It's the idea of having these deep character traits which are consistent with the person of Jesus. And so this perhaps is one of the more important, if not the most important. And that's trustworthiness and trusting. That trust is the glue that holds communities together in transition. Now, how do you create trust? Time.
Lots of time.
But what do you have to do over time? Because I know people who've been around a long time who still aren't trusted.
I don't know.
I think you have to perform and say what you're going to do, and you do it on time, or
Okay.
better. I'm going to do this, and you do it as well, if not better.
And
it is time.
You listen,
Definitely.
and you're trustworthy because no one thinks that you're trying to do something behind their back, right? And almost all, I think I told you I was once a licensed conflict mediator back in the 90s, and decided I would be the one who would solve all church problems. And I got into my first negotiation and never went into my second. Because what I found out is people didn't trust each other. And a lot of the conflict mediation tools are based on trust. But they were so convinced that other things were going on behind, and one group thought I was brought in by the other group, and the other group thought I was brought in by the other group. And I wasn't brought in by either, and I wasn't taking either side, but both of them were convinced that I was. So every word I'd say, and I just said, I've got better things to do than this. But the idea of having a trust bond, and by the way, that trust bond is not transferable, meaning you can't bring in a person and say, you trust me, now I'm telling you should trust him. It doesn't work that way. So I take that into account anytime I go into a community, even though with even Northside, I've got a lot of friends up there and a lot of people I've walked with, and they trust me, but the church doesn't know me. So why would they trust me? So the language that I use has to be very, intentionally humble, and say, whatever you do with this, I want to present what I ultimately believe to be true. But I have to recognize that in the position that I'm in, I can't bring about effective change. I can create some imagination that will cultivate the opportunity for change.
It's the second most important thing I talk about premarital counseling, because once you get to know somebody well enough, you do begin to trust. And there's a lot of things that happen after trust. But if you blow trust, you can blow any opportunity.
The shortest path back to trust once it's broken is 5 years.
Wow.
So all that means is you can make one decision that's a decision of indiscretion, and it takes that long to build back any kind of deep trust. So you got to understand the power of trust bond. And now, by the way, there are times when it can seem like trust is broken, but the way you respond to that can repair the trust. So you have to own up to it. You have to be open to it and say, look, I can understand how you misunderstood that. I did not intend to say that, or whatever. But you have to be honest. You can't do the political thing that's going on right now. That's just, how can you trust that? All right, so here are a couple of books I really want to recommend. This is one of my favorite. J.R. Woodard's Creating a Missional Culture. If you're specifically in church ministry, he has some really good timely pointers. Not all of it is helpful, but a lot of it is. Because, look, every author writes from the context that he's familiar with, right? And Woodard tries to make it a little bit more expansive than his own particular structure, but he still comes out of a structure that he tries to invite you to understand, because that's all he's got. And so that's why most of us come out of sort of independent church structures, and so it's a little bit different. But he's got some really good ideas about this. This is, if you in Roxborough's term, this is where you cultivate a missional story. And so that's a really important idea, that what you're trying to do is prepare the soil for something that's going to grow on its own. And so you've got to create an opportunity for growth. I'm writing an article right now that's giving me a little bit of problems. It's going to be a chapter in a book. The guidelines of the book is we're supposed to be very appreciative of all the good things. Basically, it's a book written to church parents on how to work beside their youth ministers in bringing their children to spiritual maturity. Okay? And so the book is written to parents, but it says we can't use any sort of negative language. But so here's my chapter. My chapter is how can we help children realize their dream and stay faithful to the church? And I so badly want to say we can't right now because there's no place for them. You know, you talk about that post-university experience going back to church, and they've been set up almost for failure. We've talked about that in here, where you have young people who have been given all this attention in their youth ministries. They go off to college, and when they come back, they're supposed to just sit there and be good. And that worked for us, and so why doesn't that work for them? And it's because their missional imagination has been ignited. You know, they want to be involved. And so part of what I have to say in that chapter is, as the church is presently constituted, I don't know how we keep a person's missional imagination alive. In other words, we're going to have to create something new, which is create what I think the church ought to be is a place where anyone can come with whatever gifts they have and find out how to use them. It ought to be a place of experimentation. And instead, it tends to be a place of uniformity, and everybody has to do the same kind of thing. And so this idea of creating a missional culture, I just ask you to look into that carefully.
Does uniformity then guide you to judgment?
Yeah.
And it's a place of judgment?
Yeah. Well, and anytime there's uniformity, you have power structures.
Mm-hmm.
And power structures become ownership models.
Right.
And so if you're going to be in that project, you have to be subject to, you can't
leader.
You can't do positive feedback. You can't say, hey, I think this might go better. And that just gets really frustrating.
Well, especially in large churches, although there's a lot to do, and a lot of large churches can do things. Ones that have been there the longest usually like to maintain their church the way it's always been. So the way to do that, of course, is always be in charge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to,
Yeah.
at times, let me not say suppress, but
Right.
not allow that imagination to grow.
Well, and that's such a different power structure. That's such a different idea of leadership. That's leadership as power instead of leadership as empowering.
Right.
And those are opposite models.
Mm-hmm.
And even I know churches that do things like they'll have a ministry fair, which I think is a really good idea, where they invite people in. But one of the things I tell them to do is, if you're going to have a ministry fair, invite people in at the director's level. I mean, don't say, come in, we need soldiers. That's what I've heard them say. We've got all these ministries and we need soldiers. Well, no one wants to be a soldier. I mean, everybody wants to be involved in helping shape what's going on. That's part of our image of Godness within us. So, if you can do, what's your family gramming? What was it?
Genogramming.
Yeah, genogramming. So I'm going to do your image of Godding.
Yeah, I like that.
Imaging of God, whatever. Yeah.
This jumped off the page. Leadership is therefore about this capacity to cultivate conversation of imagination and hope rooted in biblical narratives, but without manipulating people into a prearranged plan or prepackaged.
Perfect. That's perfect. That's it. Yeah. Because what that does is it keeps the creative juices alive. When the creative juices are alive, you're alive, right? So that's, what page is that?
115.
115. So I hope you have that underlined. I've got it. That's really an important idea. So, hey, look, in a sense then what we're talking about is structuring flexible structures instead of fixed structures. And that also allows for the work of the Holy Spirit within us. The Spirit is alive, and if we have structures that facilitate that, then good. But if our structures impede that, now I don't know if you had a chance to look at the F.F. Bruce article that I attached. Don't miss reading that, because that last paragraph is really important, where he says, structures of ministry are helpful inasmuch as they create the opportunity for the free moving of the Spirit. When structures limit that, they must be immediately replaced by better ones. And that's what churches seem to be extremely slow to do. Okay, I really like Schwell's book. Now, he's an editor of this Cultivating Sent Communities, and it's a series of articles. And if you don't like that genre of book, I wouldn't recommend it, because these are essays. But they're good content in terms of communities that understand themselves as sent communities. So it's approached in different situations and different paradigms, but I find that to be a really helpful book. This one is surprisingly good. Matthew Moore at Mayfair has gotten their leadership in on this one. And what you'll like about this one is it's a little book.
Oh, it's a little big tiny one.
Little tiny book.
Yeah.
It's maybe, 50 pages, just a few words. but pretty powerful in terms of surprising the world. And he works out of Colossians 4:2-6, which he doesn't say this, I do. That's Paul's most overt statement of how to do evangelism. And that's where he says, devote yourselves to prayer. Pray that God would enlighten me to see the doors that he opens before me, that I should speak with courage as I should. And then he turns to those who he's talking to and says, and for you as well, pay attention, make the most of every opportunity. Let your speech be gracious, seasoned as though it were with salt. And so he says that these basically, this is the missional theme, that you devote yourself to prayer and then prepare yourselves for God to open doors. But to that end, he says that there are 5 missional habits. Now, the churches I've known, this just came out, a couple months ago.
Yeah, the Mayfair guys were up here at the preaching workshop, and they turned us on, a couple of us onto it.
Okay, so it's fairly new. It's just a couple months out. And Frost and Hirsch are the 2 big missional guys, pretty much, that started this whole thing, or at least built it. And the first is this idea of bless 3 people. This is a doable thing. Get your church, every member, to intentionally bless 3 people. And what Frost does in this little book is he just sort of fills this out. So he has a chapter for each one of these. And it's very good. It's very accessible. It's not hard. I mean, I think you could get anybody to say, hey, let's try this and see what happens. But what you're trying to do is just simply cultivate missional habits. So be able to, at the end of the week, identify 3 people, one of whom is not a member of your church. So get out and help someone else, but be generous in some way, shape, or form. And he tries really hard not to put restrictions on this, but just try. Because most people in our churches aren't blessing anybody. Okay, now, understand, this isn't blessing someone like get out of my way kind of. We're talking being generous. So do something that's a gift to 3 people. And then eat with 3 people. And one of whom is new, a new acquaintance. Be hospitable. Just intentionally do this. I have a gang that I usually eat with of fellow professors. We get along really well. And it is a sacrifice for me not to eat with them because we have fun. But I'm now going to, once a week, pick out a poor, suffering student. Like they're going to love that. But it's interesting to me the kind of conversations I get into when I do this intentionally. So it's not easy. I mean, we all like our patterns of life. But think about if you have a church of 300 or 400 people and you get them intentionally sitting down and eating, being able to acknowledge at the end of the week that I've eaten with 3 people, one of whom I did not previously know. Okay? Listen. One time of intense listening to the Spirit so that you can be Spirit-led. Find a time in the week when you're just going to listen. Pay attention. Learn. One time of intense learning of Jesus, being Christ-like. And then I will journal throughout the week in the ways I alerted others to the reign of God. So these are very simple ideas. And the reason I like the Frost book simply because it's very simple and accessible. So I don't know where you are in the situations you find yourself in. So this is a wide range of readings. Some of them, like the first one that Woodward talks about creating an entire situation in a community of a missional culture. And then Frost comes along and just says, try this. Pretty simple, but I think when you think about the possibility for bringing about significant change, it's pretty impressive.
We're
Now,
doing this with our interns this summer, our summer
Good.
interns.
Good. So there's many other good sources discussing this in practical and helpful ways, and I've got a fairly developed library, and I've got more books in my library than in the university library on this topic. So if you're interested in other resources to look at, and here's what I'm talking about is resources like there's one called Field Guide for Missional Leaders, which is written by Craig Van Gelder, I think, and Michael Frost, maybe. It seems like all these guys exchange and work together on different books. Reggie McNeil has a book called Missional Renaissance, which is really good. He has 3 titles that I would recommend. His latest one is basically saying it's called I forget the major word on it, but the subtitle is why we need to quit trying to fix the church and start building the kingdom. So, the idea is it's not so much about our brand as it is about the kingdom. And so that one's really helpful. All right, so a lot of good resources on this. So if you need help with this, especially as you start thinking about your project, let me know. So mission leader in terms of faithful contextualization. Here, I think this discussion is really significant in terms of how to help our members grasp the opportunities that they have. So let me go back to something I said earlier that I think is really important here. Missional leading is not the same as corporate leading, as church leading as we presently know it. It is walking along beside. I'll tell you what it is. Here, I'll give it to you in a. Here it is in a sentence. Missional leading is leading as Jesus led. Think about what Jesus did. He had 12 who journeyed with him every day. He had 3 that he worked with specifically as sort of it seems like accountability group to me. And then he had others around him. But in his making a significant difference in people's lives, those were mostly one-on-one experiences. Now there are crowds bringing the broken to him and he's healing them. I understand that. But almost all the episodes that are talked about in the gospel are episodes of Jesus with another individual. And so, this idea of incarnational living means that we live as Jesus lived. To live as Jesus would if he were in our place. And that's a really important concept that we all know. But I do think it's been somewhat misrepresented. Because here's the point, and we talked about this earlier, but let me come back to it. The incarnation is not that we all look like Jesus, meaning a 2,000-year-old carpenter from Nazareth. Okay, it means that if Jesus were in our bodies with our capacities and our gifts, how would we live? I think that's a different question. Because it's not me trying to imitate Jesus, it's me allowing Jesus to work through me in the specific circumstances of my life. So that is imitating Jesus. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. But the idea is let him have control of your heart in the situations you find yourself in. So this is more about qualities of life than it is about specific actions. Actions grow out of the qualities that make us up. The actions come from within. And so I think sometimes we try to mimic behavior instead of understanding the process that leads to that kind of behavior. That's why, by the way, when Jesus tells us how we're supposed to live, if we simply try to conform to his teaching without changing our heart, can't do it. So it's the work of the Spirit to transform our hearts. So this idea of cultivating missional imagination, let me come back to that. The idea is that you understand your context and understand the story, that you preach relevant biblical application. Now, I had a really warm experience this last weekend. Some of you won't know Jim McGuigan, but he is a grand old Irish preacher who now lives in North Nashville with his daughter and son-in-law. And he's just, he's just an incredible man. When I was 11 years old, he was in his prime. And I was at a lectureship in Germany when my parents were doing mission work there in Italy. And we came up to Germany for this lectureship. And we stayed, all the guys stayed in a dorm. And Jim was there. And he had made this big speech in front of the whole crowd. Of course, he is the most captivating storyteller I've ever heard. And, of course, he was all of our hero, right? Well, he stayed in the dorm with us. But he'd get all of us, I was 11 years old, he'd get all the boys around at night and pray with us and pray over us, and then he'd talk to us and tell us stories. Man, I could have stayed up all night. That was so powerful to me. And he showed attention. That's when I started journaling. And I told Jim, I said, you're the reason I started journaling. And it was because he told such good stories, I didn't want to forget them. And so I have become a collector of stories ever since then. But now he's sort of, semi-retired. And so he was at my presentation on Saturday when I talked about the importance of telling the story of God from creation to new creation. And he had he sent me a long email saying, one of my concerns is if what you say is right, and I think it is, that we're living in the story of God, then what impact does that have on the preaching that we do? How does that change how we preach? Because his observation is, in most churches, what we basically have are sort of ethical sermons coming out of Scripture But, one of the points he made, he said, here we are, we live in a world where we drink clean water made by, some kind of process. We enjoy the police protection of police we do not know and fire protection. He said we go to hospitals and we live in a world where we're benefiting from all these things, and then we treat them as if they're nothing to us because we've got our church. Here's his issue here. So we preach to people in the church as if the rest of the world's not there. And if God has called us to be a people that shows the world what life could be if they would live under the reign of God, then what are we doing in the pulpit? And I think this is a really good question.
From a trustworthiness perspective, do we not trust some of those doctors and policemen more than we trust church leaders?
Yeah.
What does that say?
Yeah. Well, it does, because they're giving us something. But, this sort of dichotomy about, it seems like we use preaching to condemn the world and make us feel better about ourselves, or to say something that's going to help the people in the pews. But what are we doing to help engage in the world as missional people? And, I just think he's got a really good point. That how should, if you're going to be effective in changing the world, then you have to recognize that you're calling people to engage in the world, to work along beside of, so that whatever it is that we're teaching, we ought to be teaching competencies for living Jesus in our world in a way that can bring about positive change. In other words, preaching cannot be just simply for us, as if we're an insider group. It's got to be how to help us interact with the world. Does that make sense? So I found that to be a real challenge. And let me highly recommend a series of books written by Kevin Van Hooser. Now, some people think he's a little nuts. He's got a strange style to him in that it's unique. But he really is into this idea of everyday theology. He's the editor of the book Everyday Theology. When I read that, it really changed my thinking. Then he wrote a second book called Faith Speaking Understanding, I think. And that book I used the last time I taught this course. But I felt like it was a little bit too limiting. But here's what it does that I would highly recommend, is it talks about life as if we're on stage and teaches us how to live out the dramatic narrative of God. So it's faith speaking understanding, meaning if faith doesn't become something that we can speak to the world that helps them understand their place in the world and their need for God, then what are we doing? And then the book I used in my DMin class this last go-around was Van Hooser's book, The Pastor as Public Theologian. And that book's worth just, the very end of it, he has 55 theses, like, the 73 Wittenberg door thing, or 93 of Luther. He has 55 ideas about what it means to be a faithful pastor in today's world. And some of those are very challenging. He says the pastor leader's vocation is to seek, speak, and show understanding of what God is doing in Christ for the sake of the world and lead others to do the same. I think that meets Jim's concern. So the vocation for the leader, the missional leader, is to speak, to seek, speak, and show understanding of what God is doing in Christ for the sake of the world and to lead others to do the same. So I thought about that, and there's several classes that I teach to the undergrads where I really try to do that, where what I'm trying to focus on is how can I help you best understand your responsibility to be God's hermeneutic in the world. In other words, the world's not going to know God except through you. So can I teach you competencies? That's general enough. So go back to Chris's reading on, 115 or wherever that was, where Roxborough talks about you create structures of ministry that allow for cultivation. And that's why I like, by the way, my graphic for tonight. The idea that our work is artistry. We're actually helping people recognize who they are by allowing them to take the palette from us, and we're teaching them to paint their life into the story of God.
I also thought it's really interesting along that general idea is realized not through a controlled, managed, strategic plan. I think every time I think of leadership, it's like vision statement followed by the ways to get there. Like there is a formula to
Yep.
do this, where you've got your mission, you've got your vision, you've got your steps to get there, and as we talk about just this idea, how can you can't start that way. You can never go down that path of this is where we're going. And I think it's okay to have some vision behind it, but to just put it into the steps, I struggle with that as far as like the church, the future of the church built on just a vision statement. I don't know. I struggle with that.
I do too. And, we're walking the fine line of you. I don't think you can just have open, what's the word I'm looking for, innovation without any kind of structure or boundary or purpose. There has to be an assessment. Let's work together on something. It's not just a matter of having fluid, unorganized activity. Because the scriptures, if nothing other than the example of Nehemiah and how he was able to rebuild the walls in such a short amount of time, he had an idea. But part of his idea that was so good was that he chose to be a worker among the rest, so he had a deep trust level, and then he wasn't going to take any more rations than anybody else. He turned down all of the prerequisite or all the prerogatives of a leader and won the trust of the people. And then he organized them in groups of people who could do things that they were capable of doing. So, but it's sort of a fluid structure. So you have structure, but it's also a structure that's always open to change. And that's what I find out. And I used to write. I told you I wrote a book on this one time on strategic, how to have strategic planning. And there's some good in that, but it has to be absolutely flexible to directional change. And part of that is this, and I think, Terry, you have hinted at this, that even in corporate structures, I've seen this in some of the work I've done with corporations, that what they're trying to do is to allow, while you have responsibilities for certain work groups, there's a lot more freedom there than there's ever been before for new development and new ideas. It used to be you were given an assignment, you did it. And if you had a better idea, shut up, right? So this is structure, but it's also open to change. And a way of doing this, too, is the idea of using narratives and parables to allow members to envision themselves actively participating in what God is doing to redeem the world. It's really important, I think. Narrative is perhaps the most effective way of sparking missional imagination. It's why C.S. Lewis is so loved by so many, and why the Chronicles of Narnia are actually a substantive work. Because while he wrote it originally for his nieces and nephews, what he found out was, one of my favorite comments of the weekend, I had an older gentleman come up to me Sunday morning. And when I'm saying older, I would say he's probably in his early 80s. He said, "You've made me a child again." I love that. He said, "You brought alive a story that I don't know that I've ever really had a chance to think through." But he says, "I'm as excited as I've ever been." And that's rewarding. But, it's the idea of using narratives and parables to bring alive the imagination of those who could be participating in God's story and perhaps aren't. Okay, so the last point, we're going to take a break. Amy, you came a little bit later. I'm going to break this into 3 sections tonight because my recordings have been too long to upload under certain, anyway, we're having technical difficulties, and hopefully this will make it easier. But I want us to take a brief break, and then we'll come back in and go back into it again. Have any of you read N.T. Wright's Simply Christian? Okay. I really like his approach of all the apologetic books of our time. I think this is the best one. I would rate it above Mere Christianity because of his approach. And the subtitle is Why Christianity Makes Sense. But basically, it's this invitation into a kind of living that allows us to be agents of new creation, where we sing and speak and dance and play in such a way that the world, who hears the echoes of the voice of God, sees what we're doing and wants to lend a hand and join us in it. So this is what, Chris and I have talked to you all about how important it's been for our athletes to be able to participate in mission efforts. Because what that lets them do is they hear the rhythms of their heart match the rhythms of a passion that can only be explained in the work of Jesus. That there is a uniqueness to the Christian faith that no other faith proclaims, And it has to do with how we give ourselves away and find joy in it. Now, all religions have altruism as a part of it because we know that doing good is a good thing. But the idea of the purpose of your life is to give life to others is uniquely Christian. And it's actually in the giving of life to others that you find meaning in your own life. And so what N.T. Wright talks about is that we have these vibrations within us for things like justice and meaningful relationship and true beauty. And that if we will vibrate those tones, then all it takes is someone to get close to us, and their hearts will start to beat fast. And so again, I had another lady come up to me on Sunday, and she said, "Oh, I just can't tell you, my heart is beating so fast. I just haven't thought this way in a while." And so you're inviting people into something that they all want to be a part of. And I think when language is used appropriately, that what it does is it sparks imagination, especially for people who all their lives have felt either disenfranchised or at least on the outside. That as missional leaders, what we give them an opportunity to do is to totally revise their understanding of their life. Okay, thoughts on this first third? Any reactions?
You didn't say one of the characteristics of a leader was to have tough skin.
Yeah. Yeah. Because not all the reactions are going to be positive. And, here's the deal, though. I want to go back to that conflict mediation stuff. This is why the missional leader, I think, is probably going to have more effect than the charismatic leader, is because the changing of a person's story is going to take, it's going to take that individual one-on-one kind of discussion. I think I told you about the phone conversation I had with a gentleman several weeks ago who was upset because we had invited Deborah Hirsch. And using that idea of appreciative inquiry, where the first thing you do is you begin to ask questions about, what do you really enjoy doing? Tell me about the work you've done for the Lord. And then appreciating that and acknowledging it as being good work. And then saying, well, you understand that what I want to do is to get our young people to really be involved in that story because you found so much meaning there. Think how long you spent in your life doing things that you wish you could have started much earlier. And he's like, yeah, that's true. And then that whole conversation changed. So when you can use appreciative inquiry and give people an opportunity to envision their life as not only being meaningful, but even there's more yet to come, then that's, again, I don't know that you're going to necessarily be able to do that from a pulpit to a large group of people, near as well as talking to people in smaller groups.